Thank you very much. Actually, I haven't changed a little bit since our discussion this afternoon, actually, again. So, no, I decided to leave more room to the dialogue that we can have. As I see, I mean, actually, you know, in a kind of a boxing ring, actually. So it's a good way to introduce the effects, maybe that might occur. So I tried more specifically addressing, you know, one book of mine or one concept, you know, to maybe I took the afternoon to think about the underlines, actually, and the different concepts that are actually crossing the three books that you mentioned. So it will give, I think, a broader, you know, field of discussion. So I clearly can point three ones, actually, of everything I've been writing till now. You know, everybody has obsessions, so I was trying to map my obsessions this afternoon and try to see which were the let's say, the hidden concepts or notions that are actually, you know, working silently within the texts. And I found three notions I want to start with. The notion of origins, the opposition between activity and passivity, and the idea of the precarious and precariousness. Origins, I think, is of course the notion of origins. What is it? What are our origins? Do we have origins? Is it something that we can say without, you know, thinking a bit further of what it means, actually? If it's about space or about time, about the context, about, you know, any type of ground which might actually allow us to think that we do have origins. It's not something that goes without saying for me, so but I will, of course, come back on it. The notion of origins in relational aesthetics, for example, it's very clear. The whole book, according to me, is a kind of examination of the process of constitution of meaning in our experience of the artwork. But the fact is, in relational aesthetics, I try to say that the origins of the meaning is at least double, actually, the beholder and the artist. And it's the dialogue between the two, the perpetual delocalization of meaning within a more convivial or participatory context, which does produce the meaning of an artwork. It's not a pure creation, let's say, and the artist is not like God arriving and saying, okay, this is the meaning of the artwork. No. Relational aesthetics focuses on open structures which allow a room, whatever it is, to the beholder, to the visitor of the exhibition. In post-production, which is a book about, you know, let's say, different aspects of programming and using already existing elements in order to make art, I would say that the question of origins is obviously addressed with the statement that the borders between producers and consumers of art or culture is getting thinner and thinner, you know, today. And I took the example, of course, of the DJ, the programmer, and today even in TV series we have the showrunner, actually, which is interesting because it's he or she is supposed to be the author much more than the directors of the series. But it's and origins, of course, is frontally and brutally addressed in the last book that I published, Radicant, as I'm actually addressing the question of the root of radicality and radical being radical as a pattern from the 20th century, which is linked to the modernism of 20th century, not ours. Radical means that belongs to the root, actually. So it's, again, a question of origins. It's the will to start anew a situation. Radicality is about this. It's the tabula rasa of the avant-gardes as an attempt to create new origins, to let's say, erase, whatever was original or belonging to the ancient root, to replace it by a new root, but it's still a root. We're still talking about origins. A manifesto, for example, which is one of the most well-known patterns of the avant-gardes in the 20th century, is exactly based on the idea of tabula rasa. It's about starting anew, starting over a situation. And talking again about origins and the way actually it does irrigate all the aspects of our cultural life today. And as a critical methodology, let's say, multiculturalism, that we will talk about later, for me resembles a system for distributing meaning that assigns individual to a specific position. It reduces them to social demands, to their identity, so-called identity, which is another name for origins, in a way, for me, but we will talk about it later. And anyway, multiculturalism repatriates every possible meaning towards an origin, which is regarded as a political revealer. It's this pattern which I think is in crisis today. In one of the books, the texts that were found after his death, there was a very interesting text by Louis Althusser that I'm working on at the moment. It's a very short text. It's almost like a kind of a philosophical, a kind of koan, as we say in the Zen, thinking. It's 2 pages, and it's a text about materialism. And it takes the example of a Western movie, actually. He's writing a kind of scenario for a possible Western movie, and just talks about a cowboy who's in the middle of nowhere and waits for a train. And he says, if the cowboy in question knows where the train comes from and knows where the train goes to, then we are talking about idealism. If the cowboy jumps into the train, not knowing where it comes from, not knowing where it goes, we are talking about materialism. And this is this idea of materialism that I'm defending. And I think it's a very efficient, image to understand what I talk about when I talk about origins. The second common ground within almost all the text I've been writing is the opposition between active and passive, activity, passivity. In relational aesthetics, for example, it's clear that I'm discussing the idea that how art generates activity in itself within the beholder, himself or herself. We're not necessarily talking about participation, which is a kind of caricature of relational aesthetics. If we talk about the work of Gabriel Roscoe or many others that I'm mentioning in the book, we're not necessarily talking about systems implying the participation of the visitor. This participation, this activity of the beholder can be distributed in many ways in the artwork. It can be metaphorical, it can be, an incitation to do something. It might be only the presence, the possibility of action, of activity as such. So the patterns that I'm referring to when I talk about the relational is very diverse, I would say. But their common point is to imply the very idea of activity. In post-production, then it's even more clear, actually. It's about the erasure, or the blurring, at least, of the borders between the production and consumption. You know, consuming, buying, recuperating, using is also a way to make art. And in the last one, in Radicant, which I might maybe define, you know, once for all, to make a better understanding of my speech. Radicant means, as the opposite, as an opposition to radical. Radicant designates or describes an organism, or a vegetal organism in general, that grows its roots while advancing, while progressing. So we're talking about a dynamic, you know, enrootment, as opposed to a static root. So Radicant, of course, is about this opposition, articulates differently this opposition between the passive and the active, through, for example, the notion of viatorization. I call viatorization. It's another, actually, term that I use because there's no real equivalent, you know, otherwise. Viator, coming from the Latin, it's actually coming from a text by Jacques Lacan, where he describes the analyst as a kind of homo viator, which is this idea of displacement and traveling as a condition for thought. So this notion of viatorization, trying to make everything that's static dynamic, in a way. It's a book about that tries to acknowledge all the current processes of dynamization of forms in the aesthetic field. It's the artist, as I've been writing several times, as a semionaut, from nautos, navigation, and semio, the sign. The artist as someone who actually builds connections between signs, building pathways throughout culture by connecting forms or signs between them. Actually, it's the idea of producing a kind of trajectory, let's say. And if you look at most of the interesting things that we can see in galleries or art centers or museums today in contemporary art, it's very easy to locate this energy, you know, that's present absolutely everywhere. The idea of connecting signs of between different, that might be separated from centuries or by huge geographical distances, but which are actually connected within an artwork. That's also another aspect of activity, which is the idea of refusing the fact that history is already written. You have to rewrite it all the time. Geography, either, actually. Geography can be rewritten all the time. Yeah. But we will address this issue later. What is really passive, for example, is to accept the notion of origins as a ready-made notion, actually, or accepting your own origins as a ready-made notion. We were told that we were born this place, in such a context, within such a culture, but we can absolutely feel free to, you know, reconsider this story, because even if it's based on on something which is factual, not everything is factual in this story. It's also a part of fiction that we have to fight against all the time. Passivity is also expressed, and that's one of the main subjects of my last book, Radicant, in the extensive use of the prefix post. Post everything. We're post-political, post-modernism, post-colonial, post-feminism. Everything today has to be stamped post in order to feel like contemporary. But we could also see this extensive use of post as a sign of laziness, actually. It's a pure laziness if you think about it. It's the refusal, the denial of the possibility to qualify our times using another type of prefix. I used one actually in my last book, which is alter modern, as a way to allow a space to be opened to consider our times as specific in some ways. We're not only into the post, which means in the outskirts of history, in a way, if you think about it, in the suburbs of an event that was mythical, but that we only can follow the consequences. That's exactly what post means. So I prefer alter, even if it's not good, even if it's, of course, everybody can say, no, that is not the right one. You should use, you know, another prefix, and it's not possible. Let's find a new name, etc. Whatever. The discussion can be opened, which is not possible if we erase the specificities of this beginning of 21st century under the prefix post, just to say that we are living in a kind of gray zone of history that cannot be qualified. The post-colonial is a good example for it. It's a category which that can be criticized as such, actually, as a global theory of the power relations in culture and society within the globalized world. But there comes the third obsession, the third notion that I'm actually using without always knowing it, actually, in my writings, which is the idea of the precariousness as a category of thought, in a way. Of course, I'm not talking about sociological precariousness. I'm not talking about economical precariousness. I'm talking about a general mental state, let's say, and specifically even in the way we envision what an artwork is, and what are exactly the relations between an art and society, which is, according to me, linked with this idea of the precarious. The term, this adjective, is coming from a Latin word which is related to the right. Precaria was actually a field, a little piece of land that was given to someone, but in a temporary way. You could use it for a certain amount of time, and then it was taken back. So the precaria is something that won't last, in a way. And that's in this sense that I'm using it. The precarious is, of course, present in relational aesthetics also, of course, very clearly. Meaning depends on intersubjectivity. It's something that's like a contract, in a way, between an artist, an object or a simile object, and the people who look at it or use it. It can be quite a complex contract sometimes. But anyway, it's always based on dialogue. It's not possible to feel, well, it's still possible to envision the artwork, whatever it is, as a source of power and authority. And that's exactly the opposite of what I'm talking about. If it's about dialogue, if the artwork allows you to get into it in one way or another, we're talking about the exact opposite of what authority is, which is something that imposes itself from the higher level and that gets down to submit people or, for example. So the infinite dialogue that does exist between the visitors of the exhibition and the artworks, but also within history, and that's what I'm trying to describe in post-production. There's also a dialogue between the artist and the history of art and all the artifacts that are actually, present in museums that belong to history of art as markers from specific ideas or notions. This dialogue is always, subject to revisions. And there's a wonderful theory about it, which is Marcel Duchamp's idea of a kind of peremption date of the artwork. The artwork dies when we don't use it, when we don't talk about it, when we don't make it, alive through words, actually. Only the discourse, the text, this infinite dialogue, the way we can produce meanings out of it, can allow the artwork to survive, actually. Otherwise, it's only an object that can, be put in the cellar or the attic, and nobody cares. It's this dialogue that gives life, actually, to art. It's also another source of precariousness is the way artists use them, actually use those objects or already existing artworks or signs which are in circulation in society, for example, and manipulate them within their work. Forms are actually supposed to be used, as I was saying. They're not supposed to represent authorities that we wouldn't question or produce any type of fascination, for example. The same way, history needs always to be rewritten all the time. If it's not rewritten, if we're using ready-made concepts, we're really submitted to authority. Another pattern of this precariousness is more related to a kind of visual mode. Actually, I might call it a visual mode of precariousness. It's the flickering. When things flicker, and it's really interesting to see in the last 10 years how many artists have been using this flickering mode. Apparition, disapparition. Here, not here. No. Light as a kind of Morse code also. You can see it in many works by Kerry Twin Evans or Philip Pareno and many others. Flickering as a very specific visual mode for today's art has something to do with the idea of meaning as a circuit, actually. Today, you can feel through, for example, but I will be more specific about it tomorrow when I talk about time in art, the omnipresence of the forms of constellation, for example, archipelagos, networks, reticular forms in many ways, do indicate that the meaning is actually distributed today as a kind of circuit. And an artwork today is also a circuit of meaning. I'm referring also to what I was saying previously about origins. And the precarious is the main political notion today, according to me, in the art world. Why? Because I don't think that the political role of an artwork depends on the message it delivers. It depends on its form, first of all. You know, it's impossible to be political in a very interesting way if form doesn't follow the message, between brackets, that the artist deliver. And the main message, I think, that art, when it's really at its peak, can deliver is the following one. We are living into a kind of a permanent opposition between a power that delivers a massive message, which is nothing can change. We live in a type of economy, a type of political power that cannot be changed. And remember, I think it's Slavoj Žižek in one of his last books that was saying that it's easier for people to think about the possibility of the end of the world today than the possibility of the end of capitalism. But that's exactly it. You know, we're actually living under the huge pressure of ideology that I'm going to come back to, into a situation where actually, if we really examine our deepest thoughts, you know, we all are caught in this kind of glue which impedes us to think that things can change in a deep way, I mean. What art does is it does something very precious. It examines all the aspects that constitute our society, whatever it is, and proposes alternatives, other ways of doing things, other ways of looking at things, other possibilities to envision some aspects of our reality. Doing so, it clearly demonstrates that the reality, between brackets, we are living in is a construction. There is only a pile of scenarios that were taken into, actually. We all live into pre-written scenarios that are actually written for us. That's called a society. And those scenarios are actually criticized and, you know, made precarious by the artworks. And that's, according to me, a major political pattern that you can see in many, many works that actually are produced today. It's a constructivism, in a way. It's a spontaneous constructivism. I think that when an artist addresses such or such aspect of this social scenario, he or she introduces into the beholder the idea that things can actually change. And that if we're, let's say, if we can get rid of this ideological pressure that we're submitted to, visually and, you know, verbally, we can envision the idea of transforming the reality we are part of. And I think that's the deepest and most important political task for art today. So I was saying that, and I'm coming back to the prefix post and the critical model that it does imply or not imply. It's exactly this which is in crisis today, according to me. And if we have to address this idea of multiculturalism, which is only one version of something that's called cultural diversity, we have to do it not in favor of a kind of a new modernism that would be a standard way of seeing, a kind of systematic universalism that's actually we cannot find. You know, we don't have the tools to build something that might relate to what has been called universalism. But on the other hand, it's not possible neither to admit a pure relativism. That would mean that it's not possible to have a dialogue, actually, with the other. Both ways are equally wrong, according to me. And the problem is that today we are caught into this kind of fork, which is a kind of standardization that's brought by the global phenomenon on one side, and this permanent attack of fundamentalisms, nationalisms, which is specificity as a way to, as a way to exclude the other all the time. We could qualify this, what has been the postmodern era, as a kind of bipolarity between these two elements. Standardization on one side, which is a kind of, let's say, vulgar version of modernism, and on the other hand, the cult of relativism. It's still a binary system, and what's really striking is that postmodernism never stops saying that, oh, binarism is really bad. But that's exactly what it says, actually. It's always the colonial and the colonized, the North against the South, etc., etc. It's a system of binary oppositions which actually jail our, brains into sterile oppositions. I wanted to quote Antonio Negri and Michael Hart, actually in Empire, the book that they published, almost 10 years ago now, actually, I think, yeah. Which is interesting related to multiculturalism. They write, postmodernism is indeed the logic by which global capital operates, for it constitutes an excellent description of the ideal capitalist schemes of commodity consumption, through notions such as difference, cultural multiplicity, mixture, and diversity. Postmodern theories, they go on to say, can be understood as the homologous counterparts of religious fundamentalisms, the former attracting the so-called winners of globalization, and the latter its losers, between brackets also. Again, a binary opposition. And multiculturalism, as we know it, as we can approach it, no, I don't have time to get into details, of course, but let's say that's the common denominator. Multiculturalism is the assumption that there is a system of coexistence that should be preserved as such. It's, in a way, a kind of hidden reification of cultures, and that's the main critique I would make to it. Multiculturalism and is an ideology, obviously, and I would like to come back maybe on something which has been a bit forgotten. I think the idea of ideology. It's not very popular in some ways in today's philosophy. Came back to it rereading some text by Louis Althusser again, actually. He has a very interesting definition of ideology. And of course, we all know that there are no ideologies anymore, since the fall of the Berlin Wall, as many people tried to say at the time, which is obviously totally wrong. Ideology, Althusser says, is a representation of the imaginary relationship of individuals to their real conditions of existence. And I think this definition is quite interesting, and it opens up many many possible subject of discussion. So a representation of the imaginary relationship that we have to our real conditions of existence. In a way, a fiction that imposes itself under the, let's say, the infrastructure of our lives, in a way. And again, we find this idea that, that I try to address, talking about the precarious. This idea that things are very, solid, that they are supposed to stay and remain as they are, It's possible with this kind of glue, this cohesive glue that ideology is. And the function of ideology, Althusser goes on, is to ensure the link between people throughout their forms of existence, the relation of the individuals to their tasks set by the social structure. Ideology here, it's interesting, is not defined as a specific content. It says nothing, it has no message. It's a specific relation between people. And here, it obviously can be linked also to relational aesthetics. And more precisely, it's a relation between people that's based on subjection. In other words, submission to something. As individuals, we are transformed into subjects by a very specific process that Althusser calls the calling out. It's like a police interpellation, actually. And that's exactly the way Althusser describes it. Hey, you there! Assuming that the theoretical scene I have imagined, writes Althusser, takes place in the street. Hey, you there! The hailed individual will turn around. By this 180-degree physical conversion, he or she becomes a subject. Why? Because he or she has recognized that the hail was really addressed to him or her. And it was really him or her who was hailed, and not someone else. The calling out is the way we are, let's say, submitted and subjectivized in some ways by ideology. So according to Althusser, the subject is constituted by an ideological ailing, which is from the outside. We are subjects from the outside. Ideology is a kind of factory of the subject, in other words. And this ailing that Althusser talks about, today we can exactly see it in the streets, of course. We have to turn around all the time because we are interpelled as subjects. Something is said, written, shouted in the streets. It can be advertising. It can be anything of this kind. But messages are all around, and they are actually trying to submit us, let's say. And that's another version of the precarious, as I was saying it a bit before. Because human societies, whatever they are, wherever they are also a kind of unconscious system of production of forms and signs. And they give off and produce signs all the time, and receive them or transform them according to the specific needs. So in a way, every society can be a city, for example, to be more, give a more precise example. Any city, any society is actually structured as a human unconscious, and so as a language obviously. What's the task of the artist, if not trying to decode, transform, submit back those elements and make art out of it, to make them conscious, to show us actually what are those visible signs, or sometimes too visible, that we are living within, actually. Our social environment, whatever it is a linguistic fact. It talks all the time. It calls us out all the time. And it is this language that the artist has to master and articulate within his or her work, with its symbols and metonymies and metaphors, repetitions, etc., etc., etc. And when we talk about the precarious, that's actually what I'm talking about. This idea that nothing lasts forever, in a way. There is a very specific regime of science production in any place that has to be, in a way, decoded by the artists. Any human society, whatever it is a way to speak the language of reality that we have to be aware of as a language. It's the Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini who was talking about the written language of reality, and he was defining cinema as the utilization of the written language of reality, which is a very nice way to say it. In a way, I was previously doing a comparison between the structuration of the city or society in general and the human unconscious. We're getting back to the subject again. It would mean, in a way, that the artist is a kind of psychoanalyst of this, semi-unconscious reality that we live inside of, without knowing all the time what actually we are, exposed to. So I tried to show how the subject is subjected. That's exactly what it's about, being subjected, become subject. But this process of the constitution of the subject as a social being goes along with another process that Althusser calls the transference. It's again a psychoanalytical vocabulary. He says that the individual is, I quote, running on transference or transfer. This would be, according to him, our main energy supply. Transference, as we know, is a shift of emotions, especially those experienced in childhood, from one person to another, especially the transfer feelings about a parent to an analyst in the process of psychoanalysis. And Althusser goes on, Proposition 1, he writes, history is running on class struggle, as a motor runs on gas. Proposition 2, the individual runs on transference in his or her relations with other individuals. It's interesting because it's getting back to something which is really purely Marxist, and that actually was one of the core elements of relational aesthetics, which is the Marxist concept of the trans-individual. Again, an opposition between idealism and materialism. According to Marx, there is no essence of humanity. It doesn't exist. What does exist, as a matter of fact, is the relations that we do have one to another. This does exist, but humanity as an essence does not exist. It's a pure construction. It's ideology. This notion of transference is very interesting because it implies the idea of translating something. You transform something, one feeling here, exactly. You transform an affect or a feeling, and you turn into something else, addressing it to somebody else, for example. This is about translation, and I really do think that a concept which is not explored enough today is the notion of translation. It's something that is not very much addressed, you know, in postmodern thought, but we can come back on this. At this point, you know, because I don't want to be too long, I'm starting to be too long actually. So I'm going to go to the essential. If I say that postmodern times are over, and I tried to establish it as a kind of rewriting of history, to say that post is not a possible prefix for now, that we have to invent another one and get out of this zone of the post. It's another fiction I'm writing, of course. One could say that I'm only, you know, replacing one fiction by another. But what's really important is precisely this, you know, not to accept it as a ready-made concept, but trying to articulate it with our specific context, actually. I was mentioning as something which is really running throughout all my writings, this opposition of the passive and the active, actually. It seems that there is a very interesting new pattern, a new figure in the political scene in the last decades, which is the irresponsible subject. The irresponsible subject, the divested, the removed also, might be the main character of global politics, actually. The main character, the leading character of global politics might be the clandestine immigrant. It's a figure that actually polarizes absolutely everything else that we are mentioning or discussing in the political field today. The immigrant, the illegal immigrant even more, as the main political figure is something that we can see already in the studios. You know, it's fascinating to see how this figure has come to the fore today as a new version of the proletarian, but adapted to our specific problematics, the one of globalization and the constitution of supranational and entities. The responsible subject is not only the illegal immigrant, of course, it's us also. We're becoming more and more irresponsible, deprived of our possibilities, or even sometimes our desire for action. We are impotent in front of the progression of the logics of neoliberalism everywhere. We are the spectators of the image industry and the official information networks. We are puppets in a theater play whose director seems to be invisible, always somewhere else, actually. And something that Nicolas Bourriaud really interestingly addresses today is the fact that if you're fired actually from a factory in the north of Italy, actually, you're as a worker, you have been fired maybe by somebody who's actually living in Miami, you know, and who's retired and placing some money in a pension fund. This whole system of invisibility and abstraction actually governs our everyday experience, as we all know, actually. We are far and far away every day more from decisions, from power, which goes away into a kind of abstract and more symbolic representation. I think one of the very interesting moves in contemporary art today is the representation of the invisible. But this invisible is there is a huge factor of invisibility, which is the capital, obviously. Capital is, by essence, invisible. And it's the center of this theater play, which distantiates the citizen from the power, and us as spectators of the world from the zones of action, let's say. This abolition of the borders between the producer and the consumer, between the artist and the beholder, between the actor and the spectator, the power and its representation also is obviously, has always been a major theme within 20th century art. And I think it's one of the core points of modernity in the 20th century. And it's something, according to me, that we shouldn't, and that artists shouldn't get rid of. It's the French philosopher and psychoanalyst Jean-Claude Milner, who actually was describing May 68 as a moment of, I quote, maximal activity. Passivity has been, for a moment, totally eliminated from the political scene. It was a sheer moment of activity. And what I've tried to call relational aesthetics, actually, is not, obviously, not one of those moments of sheer activity. It's not about this. But it's a book that talks about the symbolic redistribution of the active and the passive within the art practice. Did I really overwhelm the... No, it's fine? Okay. Because I thought I was not finished, but so it's perfect. But I'm trying to cut it because I want, as I said before, privilege the discussion and the dialogue. I just wanted to get back on my feet, which is getting back on the idea of the subject that I've been discussing from the very beginning of this speech. Saying that first, the task of art might be then to at least stand for maintaining activity within the process of reification that we're actually, living in. I think that this idea of creating precariousness, pointing out precariousness wherever we are, it also defines, let's say, art as a permanent and stable system. And I really insist on this. I think relational aesthetics has been criticized, by many critics for the fact that it was actually creating systematic instability, a kind of ontological instability of the artwork. But this is exactly what I'm standing for, actually. I think this is the main point, even. The idea that we don't have any ready-made idea of what art is. The only definition we can have of this activity that's called art is not obvious. and I don't want it to be obvious. And if I knew actually what art was in a very precise way, I think it would stop interesting me in the minute right after. So maintaining activity also implies that we're redefining all the time the parameters of this activity. Art, as I was saying at the very beginning, is also has to deal with this process of dynamization of all the forms and phenomena that we are actually engaged into in our social life or our cultural life. It's what I call viatorization, put things into movement, refuse any static state of this kind of material. That's the point I wanted to make in Redicant, actually. The subject that I'm trying to describe, and which is absolutely visible, appearing in the works of the artists I quote in the book, this subject is a dynamic subject. Redicant describes, actually, defining a being that's absolutely dynamic. A being, a subject that constitutes himself or herself through a dialogue with the soils or the context or the grounds that he or she crosses, actually. Who are we as subjects? The answer I'm trying to affirm. The answer I'm trying to find. Cool, thank you. Well, getting back to the getting back to the subject. The definition I reach actually in the Redicant, which is a definition coming from the studios of the artists, coming from the artworks, coming from the practices that I try to describe in the book, is a dynamic definition of the subject. A subject that constitutes himself or herself by a dialogical process. A dialogue between you as an ego, as somebody who has so-called origins, an history, and the context, the soils or the space-times that you actually go through. It's not the same at all than accepting once for all that you as a subject is defined by a kind of original story. And that's the point I wanted to reach. It's something that I think is very vivid and very active in contemporary art today, and I think it's a set of problematics that is going to be more and more important in the years to come for obvious reasons. Let's accept this idea of the precarious. Let's accept the fact that our origins are nothing more than a starting point, and we don't know where the train goes, we don't know where it comes from, as Althusser was saying. This dynamic construction and this acceptance of the subject as a dynamic construction is a fantastic weapon against all nationalist stands, all fundamentalist, stands today. And I think that's the main element I think that I wanted to talk about today. Thank you. And I wanted to
Okay, thank you very much, Nicolas Bourriaud. think we have some time for a discussion. I've asked three people three artists. Prepare questions. Anyone wants to start? Gilad? Okay, Jonathan.
Okay, actually I prepared a question, but I will ask another one. You referred to geography being rewritten, and then you proceed and talk about scenarios or ideologies as possible link or glue between people. So my question is that something that you would see only in the the gallery space or in the art space, or is it something that you could see apply in the society as a whole?
I always try to question art from the socio-economic context of its time, actually. And for me, it's not possible even to talk about it in a excluding or erasing these types of context. There is and so what's really interesting is to locate, to designate patterns represent both in the sociological or political field and art, because it's actually more or less always the case. You know, you have always correspondences between the two. It's impossible not to see them. What strikes me today, and I will start from the studio, you know, from the gallery, in a way, from the white cube. What strikes me when you visit those white cubes that we all know is the proliferation of forms which are, as I was saying, reticular, which are artworks in the shape of networks, constellations, archipelagos. And if we talk about geography, what's interesting in the archipelago is that it's a pure fiction, actually. If you take any group of islands, how do you decide that they are an archipelago? Because you give them a generic name, actually. You decide that it's a whole, it's an ensemble that makes sense to be together. So you can, it's infinite, actually. What interests me is the fact that we passed actually from 20th century modernism, which actually was really continental in the way it was trying to build a kind of visual Esperanto, articulated mainly on geometrical abstraction, for example, which was a really solid way for the hope of an Esperanto, of a visual Esperanto. This idea of the continent that had to actually cover the whole planet. We pass from this situation, this mental situation, to a very shattered world. And the world we live in today is totally shattered, you know, in many ways. You know, things have difficulties to be connected one to another. And we're trying all the time to establish connections. The main representation of the world that we have today, if we think about it spontaneously, is the line of all the internet connections. It's points which are actually linked by, you know, this kind of fluxes, this wavelength. And it's part of our imaginary in a very deep way, I think. So today's geography is connected with this imaginary of the constellation.
How do you think it connects to movement?
If for a movement, we need a subject in a way. What's the subject of history? You know, 1 century ago, it was very simple. For example, for any Marxist, the subject of history was the proletariat, the working class. And it was seen, actually, from the end. The working class was actually existing to prepare a society without class. That was the end, and it was envisioned from the end. So we have no idea of the end, or any type of ending, actually, today. We lost the scenario, in a way. We are submerged, overwhelmed by multiple types of scenarios which are actually shattered, you know, in different social zones. But there is not a single scenario, for the better and the worse. And I'm not saying it's good or bad, you know, but that's a fact, actually. And that's exactly the same in art. The stakes of modernism, as actually established by Clement Greenberg, was really simple to follow, in a way. It was a very guiding light that, you know. And so the question is, what's the question? For me, postmodernism as a question. And the question is, where are you coming from? And origins again, you know. If you belong to such or such category or culture, I don't know what exactly is a culture, but that's, it's more complex, I think. The modernist question, on the other hand, had been, in the 20th century, where are we going to? And I think we should take this question again, not to go the same place, but at least to move. Because I really believe that there are modernist moments in history, not only 20th century. There were modernist moments before, and for me the first real modernist gesture is the Exodus. Is the way you live. One lives, you know, a reified, rigid apparatus to go into the desert, not knowing what one will find. But this movement is modernism for me. It's this moment of the crossing the desert, which is fundamental. And it cannot exist if you don't replace the question, where are you coming from, by the question, where are we going to? It's a leap that one should take, you know. And yesterday, this exodus, you know, in the 20th century, took the shape of something really linear. It was historical, vertical into history. Today, it's not possible anymore. We have to accept the idea of taking a leap into the desert and invent a new exodus based not on the idea of an end of times, but on the idea of wandering. You know, it's the act of wandering that is absolutely characteristics of our culture, I think.
You mentioned few of today's power structure attributes. Among them was invisibility, and I would add binary that you talked about as a necessary tool for controlling. I mean, maybe even a tool that without it, control cannot be maintained. So my bunch of questions will be, first of all, can we engage this invisibility only by connecting dots and pointing on the black spots of this, and that making us reporters? What makes us artists in relation to that? And the continuation of this question would be regarding the binary. Do you see any opposition for binary thinking? Can you describe a way out of it? Or I know it's a silly question, but it has to be asked, I feel. Yes. And by describing, I must say something. I mean, like, not to be trying, but sometimes when you describe what the artist should do, I imagine myself you talking about capitalism itself. Its mobility, its way of constant changing, its dynamics, its, you know, its the possibility of connecting dots, creating new meanings, performing or offering templates, offering formats. So is that a problem, or can we, you know, define that state?
That's a very good question. I'm going to start with the end and maybe go back. It's certainly not because capitalism uses such or such notions that we are not allowed or even compelled to do it. I think this, all the notions you've been mentioning have to be precisely reloaded with a totally different content than what capitalism does with those notions. Mobility is not a bad thing in itself because of the working flexibility and the destruction of that capitalism operates in the old hierarchies. Otherwise, we could make a link also between capitalism and all the avant-gardes and all the modern moments, you know, within history. You know, and then we say, okay, then what's really leftist would be to do nothing, in a way. We should not be embarrassed by this. I think it's really important not to consider notions as kidnapped by one ideology or not. Some notions are actually like mobility, flexibility, for example, which is the kind of emblematic notions for capitalism, are actually for me not linked with it at all. It's laziness, I think, to associate them. We have to, as thinkers or artists, we have to dissociate ideas one to another, dissociate notions. In order to eliminate cliches that are made out of them. The best huge cliche is, okay, as mobility is used as a kind of a tool even by capitalism, we should be against it. That's a cliche. And that's a very good question. Not as such. I distinguish two things which are very different for me. It's a free market on one side, for example, and the capital on the other hand. Those are totally associated. Those notions are totally associated now, but they actually are not. There was a libertarian, leftist movement, at the beginning of 19th century, for example, in France, with Saint-Simon and Fourier and etc., which are totally against the state as an organizing power. Things are not that simple. So that's a very interesting question, because I think as intellectuals we have to question any association of ideas that is made by any source, actually, and try to see if they can be, maybe they don't stick, one to another. Maybe we can, associate them with something else, and then create. Obviously, a different reality, a different way of seeing things also. There are many things within this very vague notion of capitalism, because that would deserve to be, of course, analyzed in a deeper way. And, just to answer at least the second point, what could be replacing binary thinking? I think it's the difference between what Bruno Latour calls the symmetrical relativism and what it stands for, which is relativist relativism, which means, in other words, a multipolar world, not reduced to the opposition of two blocks, whatever they are. You know, multipolarity is actually an answer, because within multipolarity, you can actually organize very different associations and dialogues.
There's never two things. Always a very complex system with binary between the dots. I mean, to define binary as only two things, like,
Well, how would you define
it's
it?
the relationship between two things, but you don't need to have only two things.
Not only the relationship, the opposition between them, which is slightly different. No,
No, but by that I'm saying
Mm.
how do you say?
multipolarity, or no,
Solve any problem.
it doesn't solve any problem. It allows us to think about the solution, which is different. No, it's not a content; it's a structure. No.
There's a binarism between binarism and multipolarity.
Yeah. Okay. You have a point. I do accept this binarism, which is more.
I would like to go back to the question of the origin and the discourse of identities. And I feel that many times Israeli artists are submitted exactly to this look, this gaze from the outside that actually maybe not really curious about the condition of the other, but rather than using it in order to reaffirm pre-existing political stance. And you're talking about a global, faceless, abstract force, political force. And I would like to ask you whether you think at all local, concrete conflicts are relevant to your discourse, and if so, in what way?
I think that's why I'm very interested in Machiavelli, you know, because Machiavelli is the philosopher who stops thinking, you know, with abstractions, but starts with a very specific question, which is, how can we unify Italy? It's a very specific case. It's a question which comes from the context of his times, and that would be totally irrelevant, you know, some years earlier and some years later. It's a very specific case. So another opposition, binarism that I don't, you know, accept as such, is the opposition between the universal of the concept and the singularity of the case. I think it's all in one, you know, in some ways. One cannot think, you know, without taking very specific, particular, you know, cases, you know, whatever they are, you know. For example, I think everything I say, everything I've been writing comes from the studios. That's why I'm not considering myself as a philosopher, but as an art critic, which is really important. I take something which, you know, an energy, a set of problematics, patterns, which are actually provided by the artists. What my role is only to organize them in order to make them readable or bounce over them, to relocate the problematics of such or such artist into a more global, more, you know, a more detailed situation, you know, trying to work on the landscape in a way. That's what I'm doing. You know, I'm a landscape thinker. You know, I cannot think without the landscape in front of me, which is, I think, the very specific, you know, activity of an art critic. So to answer a different way your question, I don't see no opposition, frankly. For me, it's not something that raises question in a way to my eyes. No, from my point of view, I think. Were you mentioning the way artists, such or such artists, is using a specific, event or context within his or her work? Or I think this is totally legitimate. That's what then, if it's the, of course, yes. It's. I'm more interested in nominalism in a way. For me, everything is singular in some ways, and art is a perpetual lesson of nominalism. There's no generic, entity that could subsummate and swallow all the cases that artworks are. It's impossible. Art is always resisting to any type of too wide problematization.
I was really interested in this thought of the precariousness that you develop in the third book. And but there's, as you were speaking about that, you were mentioning this together with something like a thinking of finitude. Or you didn't say it in this way. You said something like, "Nothing is going to last forever," something like that. And I thought, okay, so that might be that style of thinking, finitude, nothing's going to last forever. Precariousness is this kind of model, has to do with Heidegger's being towards death. That also leads you very close to authenticity, or to the idea of authenticity or singularity or uniqueness. And that then returns you back to the thought of origins that I thought you wanted to escape from the very, very beginning. So the idea of leaving the origins and thinking about destination rather than where we come from, somehow then at the end returns to the thought of origins. Through the sense of finitude and authenticity, perhaps, or singularity. Is that clear enough? Maybe I'll say it differently. I mean, even in Exodus, in Homer, he's leaving in order to return. I mean, there's the double movement. I mean, there's the going away, but at the end he's going to come back home and reach his home differently, of course. But he's
he leaves a place for which he never goes back.
Yeah, but still, there's the thinking of home as you leave it to create a new one.
You introduced the notion of origins into it.
No.
We're talking about Ulysses, my friend.
So maybe forget that. So maybe forget the tragedy, but that idea of the precariousness, which I think is really interesting, but then maybe has to be defined differently than just nothing's going to last forever. It has to. Yeah.
I was a bit imprecise on this. You're right. It's not the proper way to. The ephemeral is not equivalent to the precarious, if it's the answer. So I will just express myself badly. You're absolutely right on this. But here, this notion of precariousness also could be explained in a different way through nominalism, again, actually. The idea of history as nothing but accidents, a series of accidents. If you think that there is a meaning to it all that wouldn't be posterior to the facts, then you're starting to be idealist, of course, and to, in a way, to exist within fiction. My position is a bit different, being nominalist or materialist in a way. For example, Althusser was actually also mixing the two notions, as to say that being materialist is being nominalist. It's exactly the same. It's thinking history as a series of collapses, collisions, and accidents, which absolutely have no meaning per se, but each new event creates a specific line of consequences, which will create, again, other lines of consequences, but this is nothing more than that, actually. In a way, one could say that an artwork, produces, when an important artwork like the first ready-made, or the Malevich or Pollock, whatever, creates not only consequences, but also its own causes within history. An artwork produces not only the future, but also the past. It's a bifurcation in time, but I will go on like that tomorrow, more specifically. This designates a vision of history as nothing more or nothing less than a huge series of collisions, with no origins.
Sorry.
Sorry. Okay. Hi. I'm interested in your notion of specificity. As an art critic, how can you look at, define, situate singularity or specificities when everything is interrelated, connected to an abstract power, or flickers? I liked very much the way you mentioned, because even if it's, you mentioned Kirit Van Evans. So for me, his work not only flickering, but the quotations that he uses, his interrelation with the then and so on and so forth, is related to never being specific or singular. So, yeah.
Here again, I don't see the opposition between the specific or the singular and the fact that everything is interrelated. Because for things to be interrelated, they need to be distinct one from another. Or if not, there's no possible interrelation. There's an entity which is unique. So if diversity does exist, it implies that its elements, the elements that constitute a diversity, are distinct one to another, which means specific or singular, actually. So, of course, things are not, here again, binary. There's not, on one hand, interrelations or possibilities to link things one to another, and on the other hand, specificity in the sense that every work would be absolutely unique, and it's possible to envision it, only in a very specific way. I would say that here again, it's about unfolding, and I think that's our task. You're saying you're an art critic, we're. Yeah, absolutely. Think about, for example, if you see a still from a motion picture, if you go to the movie theater, for example, outside the movie theater, you have photographs, generally, some documentation about the film. You could say, as a beholder, that those images, those stills taken from the film, have an aesthetic value, for example. They can be considered also as unique, as something which needs to be considered as itself also. But the most important is the film, to which they are related to. I think specificity or this kind of uniqueness that you were mentioning, these singularities, we have to produce them also. It's the dialogue between a specific vision, the one of the artist and the one of the beholder, that can or cannot produce a singular situation. It's also the way you use the artworks, which is important. It's not a quality that's, you know, ontological, no.
I was very impressed by your talk because you managed to not mention the word criticism, but at the end you say, I'm an art critic. I think it was very successful. And of course it's clear to me why, because your practice and your writing is opposed to any notion of antagonistic notion of politics. So it's clear to me why you didn't use it. So my question is, okay, if we see cultural and artistic practices as a way to kind of deterritorialize or hijack capitalism or information system, how do we differentiate between ones that purely maintain the system, meaning conservative ones, or in the context of politics, highly rightist ones, as opposed to leftist ones, right? How can we differentiate, for example, an artist like Matthew Barney from Pierre Huyghe? I mean, how do we create this kind of conceptual and critical apparatus that is not antagonistic, but still retains a notion of quality?
Maybe because I'm not, you know, you're right, into the antagonist and into antagonisms, you know, but into agonisms, you know. I was discussing this with Chantal Mouffe not long ago. Actually, she was always surprised by the way people totally, you know, were misinterpreting our theories by thinking about antagonisms, as she was really mentioning something much more subtle than that. I think that's very much related to the notion of critique, which is a kind of a spontaneous declaration of opposition to something, which is the highest, the most naive thing that you can think about in a way. You know, you say, okay, I stand against that. What's the work showing? What does it produce? What's the productivity of an artwork? I think that's exactly what differentiates Pierre Huyghe and Matthew Barney for me. Pierre Huyghe. But you're mentioning Matthew Barney, maybe it's not the right example, but you know, because I can be interested in some aspects of the work of Matthew Barney. But it's true that, you know, Pierre Huyghe makes me, you know, see things that Matthew Barney doesn't allow me to see, because I think he's into illustration much more. You know, he's producing a visual universe, which, and it's not the fact that it's a critique or not, you know, because if you talk about Pierre Huyghe, you know, he would never mention the word critique, you know, in his work, you know. Well,
the word form, but the word form.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, that's why I was like, you mentioned the word form.
Yeah, to go a bit faster, but it's true that, you know, even myself I've been writing about the notion of format as more interesting than the notion of form.
This is the difference between Pierre Huyghe and Matthew Barney, form and format.
That's another aspect. Pierre Huyghe interrogates, questions, and problematizes. You know, the forms and formats is actually using and manipulating. Matthew Barney accepts them as a pre-given element, and it's not critique. It's a potential of activity. You know, I would say that's displayed into a specific discipline, a specific field. That's another aspect. But your question, you know, goes quite far because it's the question of the criterion that you're actually mentioning.
I said I was serious when I said I was impressed by the way that you did not use this term. I'm interested in your practice as a curator and a critic. So how do you make decisions? How do you, and I think for artists it's interesting, so how you don't feel any amazing notion of politics, and of course you're not a formalist, because Frankfurt is way beyond. So what will be the kind of criteria that you will at home create, even for each project that you make, which would drive the theoretical position?
Well, if we go into the field of curating, I would have a different answer, I would say. Let's go into this field, because maybe it's more, maybe more obvious. First, it depends on the... I don't have the same type of thinking when it comes to an exhibition than when I write a book or a text, anyway. I never try to transpose, a way of thinking into the other field. I don't want to make illustrative exhibitions, for example. I always ask more to the exhibition than only transcribing what I'm writing on. And an exhibition, it's like an opera, in a way. You just, as a curator, you write the libretto, which is your writing and determining a certain set of parameters from which the works will be read or perceived by the beholder. You intervene in the meaning in some ways. Whatever you do, even if you don't want to, I think. But then you have this kind of libretto, and I think a good exhibition is a group exhibition, I think, is an exhibition where you can hear the voices of the artist as more than your own voice as a curator. It's really important, to leave way to both, actually, that every work can be read and perceived as such, and within the context I am trying to put them in. So it's the organization of a kind of dialogue between the way I want to put where I want to put my voice as a curator, and what's the type of intervention I'm operating, and the works themselves. So the criterions are much more complex when it comes to an exhibition, because it depends on the context of the show. It depends on the type of effect I want to produce, on the type of problematics I want to address. And sometimes I would include an artist in an exhibition that might not want to write too much about, or which for the moment doesn't interest me in that regard. Exhibitions and books are for me two different type of practice, which are answering one to another, but which are not melted one into another. So it's a very difficult question. I could only answer by talking about a specific exhibition. Why did I choose this or this artwork or not? Otherwise, I try not to have universal criterions, that would make the difference between the good and the bad and forever. Sometimes it's not what it's about for me.
Maybe one last question. If you can get up. Failure.
It depends to what's the inverse notion. Actually, is it success? Achievement? I think. Yeah, okay. Of course, yes. Yeah. I think failure is part of the process, and I don't know what achievement is, in a way, if we go into that direction, anything could go, That's another side aspect of precariousness, actually, is that there's no ideal, no perfection possible, so no pure achievement that would totally take, the notion of failure aside. It has to be integrated anyway into your way of thinking, I think, including mine.
Maybe one last question, Arkadiusz, just a very short question.
Well, if I understood correctly, it's a question about, let's say, storytelling in a way, because that's what it's about. If you decide, a posteriori of the meaning, of of any series of events, you're doing some storytelling in a way. You're deciding for yourself or in the name of a group, or whatever this group is, of the meaning of a series of consequences and causalities, let's say. I think the huge problem we're actually facing today is our refusal to do such a storytelling, actually. There's a huge crisis of futurology, in a way, which is, on one side, interesting because it makes our world a kind of pure immanence, and on the other hand, a kind of impoverishment of our capacity to project ourselves into the future. We're discussing this during lunch, actually, about this text by Walter Benjamin about experience, when he writes that the First World War was the moment where started a kind of impoverishment of experience, because people were faced to such a disastrous event that they were not able to translate this into words. And it was the beginning, according to Walter Benjamin, of this kind of impoverishment of experience. It's interesting if you relate this to the future. We didn't think about it. But in a way, maybe it's going backwards today. We're so shocked by the possibility of the future that we are not able to put words on it. We are just mute. We cannot talk, and we say actually nothing about it. And that's very interesting to see that science fiction even becomes a kind of subject matter for the artists, But the science fiction of yesterday, it's Philip K. Dick and etc. It's yesterday, and here we are very interested in what the past has to say about our future, but we don't really talk about it anymore. Interestingly, since 2001, actually, the whole world is noon now. But till 2001, actually, which is really fascinating when you think about it. There were still a few blank spots on the map in Borneo. Since 2001, it's finished. We are living, for the first time, we are the first human beings living on a planet Earth, which is absolutely known from A to Z, from every millimeter of it is well known. What does it imply, actually? There's no blank spot anymore to go to, nothing to discover. So what's left? It's the past. We're exploring the past all the time. We're exploring memory. We're exploring our, our attic and our cellars. And this you can see in the galleries, I think also. But it's not. It's something which is a bit aside your question, but not that much in a way. I think the real problem is our ability as human beings to write, to do the storytelling, to be able to qualify as in terms of quality also, and to qualify our experience. We have nothing else to say than we are post something.
Okay, so on behalf of everybody here, I want to thank you very much for this very, very generous talk. Thank you very much. And I also want to invite you. I also want to invite you all for the talk tomorrow. Bye-bye.